Good morning, and welcome to the Rankin Report for Sunday, April the 3rd, 2022. We're picking up again our series on the history of America and what are called the old stories. Stories about the formation of this nation that don't get a whole lot of attention too much anymore because they have been either deliberately or unconscious or without necessarily intent been removed from history textbooks and just kind of forgotten by people who are trying to push an agenda or who just figure that, oh, this is unbelievable. There are a lot of stories connected with our history, and we're going to start that deserve to be retold and need to be retold for the sake of understanding just how God had a hand in the formation of this nation and what God has planned for this nation. And we're going to start today with a story that most people tend to associate with the Old West and a lawman by the name of Wyatt Earp. In recent films depicting the career of Earp and his brothers and friends and the circumstances leading up to and after the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, we find a story that is picked up in several films that have been done recently about them, dealing with a gunfight with outlaws that took place along a creek where Earp simply waded out into the creek and was in the midst of gunfire at almost point-blank range. His coat received bullet holes on either side of him. Other clothing was damaged as well, but he got out without a scratch. Earp had a legend about him, or a story told about him, that he was never ever wounded by gunfire, which only adds to his mystique in terms of Western aficionados. And there is some historical background to this. There is evidence in the form of letters and Earp's own testimony to that effect. Now, we will believe a story like this, but this happened once before in American history, and it happened to a fellow who was a colonel in the Virginia militia, who was serving with British General George Braddock, or Edward Braddock, excuse me, not George. I'm giving it away already. Edward Braddock in the campaign in the French and Indian Wars of 1753 to 1763. The British and their allies were fighting the French and their allies for control of what the British considered their territory, which included western half of the state of what is now the state of Pennsylvania. Those who are from there, as I am, and those who live there should be somewhat familiar with the story. This colonel in the Virginia militia was 23 years old, and he had 100 volunteers with him in the militia, buckskins they were known, joining forces with Braddock and his 1,300 British troops. Their goal was to take a fort at the juncture of the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers, where it forms the Ohio River. That fort was known as Fort Duquesne. And the expedition reached a point 7 miles from Fort Duquesne. And they were following a path through a wooded ravine when they marched directly into a waiting ambush. And I'm reading from an article compiled on the subject by the folks at Wall Builders. They marched directly into a waiting ambush, and the enemy opened fire from them from both sides. Braddock's soldiers were veterans of European wars that traditionally fought on open ground rather than in the woods, such as Pennsylvania. Bill Cosby used to tell a joke about this, that what would happen if you had a referee who called a coin toss before every war. And in the case of this war, the colonists won the toss, and they tell the referee what they wanted, and the referee tells the British, okay, the settlers say that during the war they will wear any color clothes that they want to, shoot from behind the rocks and trees and everywhere, says that your team must wear red and march in a straight line. It's a somewhat flippant description of what actually happened. British troops in red coats, that's where they got the name from, when they came under fire, they lined up shoulder to shoulder along the bottom of the ravine. It was standard tactics for those days, particularly if you're fighting in an open field. But they weren't. They were fighting in the woods, and people were shooting from behind the rocks and trees and everywhere, and not surprisingly, the British troops got slaughtered. Excuse me. Over a 2-hour period, 714 men were shot down, with only 30 of the French and their Indian allies being shot, nearly all of those by Washington's troops, who were accustomed to woodland warfare, and they shot from behind the rocks and trees and everywhere. Now, of the 86 British and American officers in the battle, 62 were either killed or wounded. The troops were told, fire at the officers. Without them, the whole unit scatters. There was only one mounted officer that was not shot down off of his horse. And this man had been particularly vulnerable, riding back and forth rather bravely along the front lines, delivering Braddock's orders among the troops. Braddock was mortally wounded in the attack. And this colonel took command, gathered the panicked troops, retreated back to Virginia, and along the way, Braddock died. So the colonel, who had been requesting military chaplains for the troops of Virginia, had been regularly refused by the governor of Virginia, so he took on himself the role of a military chaplain, personally conducting the funeral service, reading scriptures, and offering prayers. Excuse me. The colonel and his remnants finally reached Fort Cumberland in Maryland, and word had spread across the colonies while they were retreating there that all the troops had been killed. So the colonel promptly wrote his family, assuring them that yes, he was still alive, but only as a result of what he described as the miraculous hand of miraculous care of Providence. He wrote to his brother, as I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account, of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting the first and of assuring you that I have as not yet composed the latter. But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectations. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions every side of me. Word of this supernatural protection also spread throughout the colonies, and the Reverend Samuel Davis, who was considered at that time the greatest pulpit preacher in America, and a notable leader in the national revival known as the Great Awakening, suggested that the manner in which God had directly intervened to preserve the young and largely unknown colonel, he was only 23 at the time, certainly seemed to indicate that Providence has hitherto preserved him for some important service to his country. That colonel was George Washington. And additional confirmation of this story came years later in 1770. Washington had returned, for whatever reason, to the same Pennsylvania woods in which he had earlier fought. He was on a peaceful surveying mission this time. And an ancient native chief heard that Washington was back in the area, and he traveled to meet him, explaining, "I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle." And over a council fire, the chief declared that he had been a leader with the French 15 years earlier, and then recounted the battle from his perspective. He explained that he had ordered his braves to single out the officers and shoot them down. Washington had been specifically targeted. Being about 6 foot something tall, it's not hard to guess why. The chief proudly announced that his own rifle had never before been known to miss. But after personally firing at Washington 17 times without effect, he concluded that Washington was under the care of the Great Spirit. He therefore instructed his braves to stop firing at him, confessing to Washington that he had, quote, come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. Red Hawk, another native chief in the battle, made a similar account, testified of shooting 11 times at Washington without hitting him. And because his gun never missed its mark, he too ceased firing at him, and likewise was convinced that he was under divine protection. 24 years later, when the American Revolution had broke out, in the Battle of Brandywine, 1779, a similar incident occurred. Throughout the battle, British Major Patrick Ferguson, a renowned rifle shot and head of the British sharpshooters, quietly moved his men around in the forest, singling out one American after another, shooting them down. As the battle proceeded, he pointed out the next target to his men, and he and 3 of his best sharpshooters drew down on the unsuspecting victim. But just before Ferguson ordered them to fire, he experienced a surprising impulse, later recounting that the thought of shooting that particular soldier suddenly disgusted him. The American officer, now at point-blank range, turned and looked directly at Ferguson, locking eyes with him over the sights of Ferguson's rifle. After a few moments, the American slowly turned his horse, deliberately showed his fully exposed back to Ferguson, and then calmly rode away. Ferguson recalled, "I could have lodged 6 balls in him before he was out of my reach, but I let him live." He later discovered that it had been General George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, whom he had allowed to live. People hear stories like this nowadays and think, oh, that's just gas that's created to enhance the person. Story might have been concocted during Washington's campaign for president, which Washington, by the way, did not want to do. He had been called into action after the Constitution was created, because the men who had drafted it figured only Washington would be the only choice for the first president under the new document and would help hold the Union together at that point. So when they rode out to his home in Mount Vernon, Washington's response was reported to be, "Have I not done enough for my country?" Led the Continental Army through wars, through the Revolution, helped establish the new nation, and figured, okay, I can retire now and tend my farm and all that sort of business. Not quite. Still had one more job to do. But most people would figure this was a good story told at told at campaign rallies. It is not. It is accurate. It is true. This is one of the many types of stories of divine intervention in the making of the United States and the keeping of the United States. There are many more besides these. And next week, we're going to get to another story of how the Continental Army was preserved at a decisive battle in the Revolution that saved the Revolution and proceeded to move the United States toward full independence from Great Britain. And we'll take up that story next time. These are the stories that need to be told again. And I know I might be speaking to some people who perhaps are pastors. I don't know who all is watching these things. But if I am speaking to a pastor, this is the type of story that needs to be told once again. If the schools will not do it, then it is up to the church to take up this campaign, to take up these accounts and deliver them again to the people. This is why I am taking time to do this, because the stories need to be told. Just as the old stories of the hand of God in the creation of Israel were to be told to each succeeding generation, so these stories of God's hand on the United States need to be told again. And they probably first need to be told to the adults, because they probably haven't heard this that much either. Those who are now having children of their own are probably have never heard these things, or if they have heard, it was just in passing, and probably with commentary from their teachers saying, yeah, ooh, wild story, yeah, let's move on. Because they have to be the ones to tell their children. If the schools will not do it, the church must. And if you're a church that is large enough, you have a church that is large enough to have small groups or particular Sunday or different types of lessons in Sunday schools for both the adults and the kids, consider asking your pastor to permit these stories to be set up. There's lots of places you can get these stories from. Wall Builders is just one of them. They're probably the most well-known, and I would recommend them as a source. But there's other places to get these as well. Tell the parents so that they can pass the word on to their children. Then once the parents are told, set up something for the kids. They need to know these things. They need to know that the exceptionalism of America is because of the hand of God on this nation. That's the Rankin Report for Sunday, April the 3rd, 2022. God bless you. Have a great day.